Hello everyone, I hope you're doing fantastic today. I hope you're making the best of the holidays despite these very strange times. Today I am reviewing the book A Secret History of Witches, and I thought I would review it from my perspective as a witch as well as just a simple book reviewer. I read this book earlier this fall, I think in October or November, and I had wanted to read it for a long time because of course I am a witch and I love any sorts of books about witches. I had a lot of thoughts about this book, so I thought I'd sit down and talk them through in a separate review video. Just so you know, this review has some light spoilers for the book. I'm not going to talk a whole lot about specific plot beats of the story, but I am going to allude to certain experiences that different characters have. I don't think this book relies a whole lot on spoilers, but this is just to let you know if you want to go into this book cold. So let's get right to it. Let's talk about A Secret History of Witches by Lousia Morgan. This book is about a family of Romany witches called the Orchières, and the story opens with them fleeing persecution. They escape from a horde of witch hunters in France, and they end up settling down in Britain. Throughout the story, we follow 5 generations of women in the Orchières family, and we start out in the 1820s and end in the 1940s, just after World War II. Our main characters are Nanette, Ursule, Irene, Morwen, and Veronica. Each of these characters go through their own process of growing up in a magical family, discovering their own magical abilities, fleeing persecution, needing to hide their gifts from outsiders, falling in love, and passing on their gifts to the next generation. We also get to see how they interact with changes in the world as history progresses, as well as the complex nature of mother-daughter relationships. I will say that I enjoyed the first 70% of this book. Lousia Morgan is definitely a beautiful writer, and if you like atmospheric writing, you will probably enjoy her style. I love the descriptions of these women's everyday lives, the world around them, and the magic that they perform. I love reading about witches bringing magic into their everyday, mundane lives. It gives the story a grounded yet mysterious air. And it's pretty evident that Lousia Morgan did do a lot of research about historical landmarks in Cornwall and Wales, since these do heavily feature in the story. As for plot, I can understand some of the complaints that the story arcs for some of the characters can be a bit repetitive. Nanette and Ursule especially have pretty similar character arcs. They're both generally pretty decent people. They both come into their powers during family rituals. They both live out their days farming on the land. They both fall for men who generally leave them to single motherhood. And they both give birth to magical daughters whom they have to teach about magic. And I think that's why the story got really interesting with Irene, because she was a terrible person who used magic for very selfish reasons. Her main goal in her story was to attain wealth through marriage and to maintain her social status. There was definitely a very tense point in the story where she was trying to force her daughter Morwen into an arranged marriage, which Morwen was desperately trying to escape. That was probably the part of the story where I was the most on the edge of my seat and waiting to see what would happen. I had the most issues with the last character, Veronica's story. In the book, she gets the opportunity to use her magic for Britain's war effort during World War II, and she's recruited by, of all people, Queen Elizabeth, the wife of George VI and mother of the current Queen Elizabeth. At that point, the story seemed to devolve into some weird historical fanfiction where the Queen was secretly a witch the whole time and has a coven of witches who work with her. Something about that liberty with history just kind of took me out of the story. I'm sure it sounds fun and interesting in concept, but the kind of story we were dealing with was a story of magic being grounded in reality, and something like King George VI's wife being a secret witch and performing spells for the war effort, I guess it felt so outlandish to me that it kind of took me out of this grounded feeling of the rest of the book. Overall, this was a book where I was more invested in relationships than characters. Because of the nature of the story, we can't spend that much time with each character and in their head, but the intergenerational aspect of it meant that the focus was on the relationships between characters, especially between mothers and daughters. And I didn't really mind if certain events of a character's story story repeated in another character's life, because a big theme in this story is the cyclical nature of families and how they evolve yet stay the same. So overall, that was an aspect of the book that I was totally fine with. Now, of course, as a witch, I paid a lot of attention to the presentation of magic in this book. So I'll give my thoughts on the positives and the not so positives. First, I liked how a lot of the magic in this book is related to nature. An example is how the Orshier's magic allows their farm to thrive when they first moved to Cornwall. Ursule in particular is very connected with animals, so dealing with livestock is how she thrives. I liked how ceremonial the family rituals were, and I liked how when each girl feels her power coming on, it's described as being something similar to a menstrual pain. I also really liked that how the magic worked was very mysterious. I did see a complaint that it's very ambiguous how the magic in this book works, but I actually liked that. That's how I experience magic in real life with my witchcraft practice. From my experience, you can follow spell instructions and recipes to the letter, and oftentimes you still can't control the results or what you're going to manifest. That's why I really liked how one of the women would perform a spell, and there was a lot of narrative tension around how it was going to manifest and how soon. And also, we weren't always sure about what the consequences of the spell were going to be. Sometimes one of the characters would perform a love spell or a fertility spell, and sometimes it would go well, and sometimes it would pay off, but at a cost. And that's why it was so disappointing when Louisa Morgan just brushes over the spells performed during the World War II section of the book. It's like they did a spell, and it worked on the Germans, and they did another spell, and it also worked. Like during that section of the book, I was zoning out a ton. I felt like I was being expositioned at instead of being told a story. And it just wasn't as rewarding to read about, which is a shame because it's World War II and the idea of incorporating magic into warfare is fascinating. I mean, the Nazis themselves were known to have used occult practices for their war effort during World War II. There were just some real missed opportunities to utilize and write about some fascinating, interesting magic in this section of the book. And Louisa Morgan is perfectly capable of writing beautifully about magic, so that was a letdown. I also would have liked for more spells to be detailed in this book. I think the spell that received the most attention and detail was the love spell, which is composed and used several times in the story. I think there was another healing bread spell with star anise that Veronica uses towards the end of the story that was also pretty cool. So it's a really nice touch when spell ingredients and methodology are detailed in this book, which is why I would have liked more than just the love spell. I think a really good opportunity for this would have been the World War II section. It would have been really cool if we could have been walked through these women putting spells together and anticipating the results. I think it all really comes back to those World War II chapters for me. I just can't get past them. Now, the next bit I'm going to discuss is a bit more cagey and complicated. So according to the book, the Orchiers descend from a line of French Romany witches. Sometimes they even refer to themselves as gypsies, which used to be a common term for Romany people, but is now considered quite derogatory. Now, from what I know, it's not at all unlikely for a Romany family to have a long tradition of witchcraft. Magical practice is a big part of Romany culture and that belief system. But as I read this book, I realized that the magic and witchcraft utilized by the Orchier women is actually very similar to Wicca. Now, Wicca is a Western neo-pagan religion that originated in the early 20th century. It was derived from the practices of many secretive English witch covens, and it was first popularized in the 1950s by prominent figures such as Gerald Gardner and Doreen Valiente. Wicca has been very influential in the world of Western magic and paganism, and while a lot of modern Western witches do not identify as Wiccan, there is a good chance that their magical practice includes some Wiccan elements or concepts. A lot of Wiccan practices stem from old Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Druidic occult tradition. This is very apparent in the concept of the Wheel of the Year, which is a set of 8 Sabbats which are celebrated throughout the year. You have your summer and winter solstices and your equinoxes, which are celebrated across many cultures. But then you have Sabbats with very specifically Celtic origins, such as Imbolc and Lammas. So yes, in the book, the Orchiers celebrate the full Wheel of the Year, year, which wasn't formalized until the 20th century, including Sabbats like Imbolc and Lammas. So as I was reading this book, I thought, if the Orchiers are an old family originating in France, why are they celebrating these specifically Anglo-pagan holidays? I could buy into it if they had some British roots, but they explicitly don't. Now, you could say I'm nitpicking with the Wheel of the Year, but what really got to me were the religious beliefs of the Orchier witches. Many times in the book, they refer to their worship of a universal goddess, which is a fundamental religious belief in Wicca and many modern witchcraft practices. So they don't worship one specific deity or goddess like Diana or Aradia. They worship one universal goddess. The thing is, based on my research, most Romani are actually Christian. Even Romani witches are Christian and therefore consider their magical practice part of their worship of God. If you look at pictures of traditional Romani magic practice, they utilize Christian iconography. So it's unlikely that this Romani family would believe in a universal goddess if Romani people were and are largely Christian, let alone have any concept of the Wheel of the Year. Now, I read an interview of Lousia Morgan, and I know she wasn't specifically trying to make the Orchiers Wiccan. She derived a lot of concepts from Wicca, but there were also some elements of her Roman Catholic practices. There is scrying in the book, which is used widely in many magical traditions. So really, she was trying to make up her own heavily Wiccan-inspired witchcraft tradition for this family. But the thing about putting specifically Romani witches in your story is that you have a people who already have their own unique witchcraft tradition. Now, it's not as if you can do a whole lot of in-depth research into the intricacies of Romani witchcraft tradition. Based on what I know from people who have actually interacted with traveler ethnicities, Romani people tend to be extremely secretive about their practices, to the point where even if you are part Romani, you still will be excluded from the family practices because you aren't Romani enough. Even books written by people like Raymond Buckland about Romani magic, they tend to be based on hearsay and therefore aren't that reliable. So I think Lousia Morgan's choice of including Romani people is really problematic here. People from traveler ethnicities like the Romani people are a historically misunderstood and persecuted people. Discrimination persists to this day, even in the legal system. Even now, in many European countries, it's impossible for people from traveler ethnicities to attain citizenship even if they have lived there their whole lives. So it's kind of disappointing to see an author appropriating a persecuted people and their reputation for witchcraft, but not doing any basic bare bones research about them, their beliefs, or their history. You can't just give a people who already have their own culture another culture that you just made up just because you don't know much about them. You're just perpetuating the misunderstanding of that people. And Lousia Morgan didn't have to make her witches Romani. She could have made them just any random magical family that's kind of alienated from society. But she decided to use the name Romani as a catchy label to get a reader's attention without considering that she was writing about a real group of people. So ultimately, I do acknowledge that this book is well written. It has some great character relationships, and for the most part, it incorporates magic very gracefully into the story. But this appropriative aspect of the book has made me sour on the story the more I think about it. It's not necessarily a bad book, and I'm not discouraging anybody from reading it by any measure, but I do encourage going into it with a critical eye and an awareness of the more problematic aspects of the story. Initially, I gave this book 3.5 stars, but now I would probably bump it down to 3 stars or even 2.5. So that was my review for A Secret History of Witches by Lousia Morgan. Let me know down below what you thought of this book if you have read it as well. If you are a witch who has read this book, did your witchcraft practice or your experience as a witch inform your reading of this book? Let me know down in comments, like this video if you liked it, and subscribe to my channel. You can also follow me on Twitter and Goodreads and Instagram, and I will see you in my next video.